Okay, next one.
Yeah, next one's pretty similar, but let's try it.
Who's up?
I'll go. I work with a lot of younger clients that have high incomes and are looking to save aggressively and retire early and take on the risk. If you were to play this out and actually give them factual based advice, how would you do it? For example, would you just encourage larger small cap value allocations?
Yeah, so there's a post that was circulating on Twitter that was like a quote from Reddit, and I think the many people get obsessed with the concept of FIRE, financial independence, retire early, and when they get there, they're just really bored. And so this post on Reddit was this guy who's 40. I think he had something like $2.6 million in liquid assets, no kids, wife is still working full time 9 to 5 job, and this guy's retired, and all he does all day is sit around eating THC edible candy and playing video games. And his wife is just so disappointed and is like calling him a loser and stuff, right? And he just kind of like doesn't really know what to do with himself anymore. And this, I guess, is probably not his ideal view of retirement. Like when he was starting his FIRE journey, like maybe in his mid 20s or something like that, I don't think he was probably like, yeah, I want to sit around all day and use drugs and sit on the couch and play video games. Like that's not usually everybody's goal. So I think a lot of people who have this expectation of what early retirement might look like just need to be very careful with that, because it's not always as rosy as it seems. I totally get the desire for financial independence, right? Like you want to be in control of your calendar. You want to hit that point where you have sort of a work optional lifestyle, and that's fine. But I think to answer the question, we already largely answered it, right? Like look at other, like how is the portfolio set up now? What reasonable risks can you take that are going to increase your expected rate of return? And is there anything else that you can do to increase your total portfolio value over time? Like, can you save more, right? But I don't know that, like somebody who's already doing that, 100% equities, saving everything they can, there's not a ton that makes sense to me that would jump out as go do this thing now.
It's a tough thing too. Like if you're talking about somebody who is, saving aggressively and wants to retire early versus someone who is saving aggressively and wants to retire later, right? If your goal is to retire early, meaning, I don't know, 5, 10 years from now, regardless of your age, you got to be careful about how much risk you take with your portfolio, right? You don't want to be in 100% equities 3 or 4 years before you retire. So it's not always those goals might be incompatible, right? It usually young investors have the risk capacity, right? They can go 100% if they want to because they have a very long time horizon. But early retirees don't have a very long time horizon, at least to the retirement date. Of course, they need to make their portfolio last for a lot longer,
Mm-hmm.
which is why I don't know. This then becomes a difficult asset allocation decision, doesn't it? Because, on one hand, you need to make your portfolio last for 50 years instead of 30,
Mm-hmm.
which means you should probably be more aggressive. But if
Right.
you're more aggressive, then it's harder and harder to draw down the portfolio during those negative years. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. FIRE is a difficult financial planning question for sure. It's got a number of problems as well as the lifestyle issues which you touched on, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't appeal to me, which is good because I'm no longer young, but it never would have. I can't imagine, having retired at 40 and not had that to do for the rest of my life or my career. I don't think I'm so focused on work that it's my whole identity, but it's certainly something that gives me purpose. So
Yep.
Well, listen to this, Dan. I'm going to argue that you actually did FIRE because you did the same thing as so many of the FIRE people did, is that you left one career and then started giving other people advice on how they can too retire. That's literally like every FIRE blogger out there leaves
yeah,
one
except I
career.
work twice as much now as I did when I was 30.
So do the FIRE people.
Uh, yeah,
Those they
maybe.
travel around, they write books, they
Mhm.
blog however many times a week. Like it's no joke. I always found that funny about the whole concept is that so many of the influencers, at least in that space, and maybe there are people who actually follow the principles without being influencers. But so many of the influencers say like, yeah, I retired early, I quit my job. But then meanwhile, they're making however much money by doing
Yeah,
something else, a different
it's
job.
not retirement. It's just a career change. I think you're right about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
In a lot of cases. And maybe there are people that are very quietly actually retiring early and we just don't hear from them because they're doing things that they love. Maybe there are people like that, but you don't.
because they're on the couch and
Yeah,
yeah. So
those aren't the ones you hear from. I will say on this one too, actually, that in that fire space, there are a lot of pretty wacky investment ideas that have come out of there to try and deal with the problems that you were talking about, Dan. I've seen all kinds of weird strategies with funny names that are supposed to solve those problems, but I think typically they probably exacerbate them as opposed to solving them. But yeah, it is for sure a hard problem.
All right, move on to the next one.
Sure.
Yep.
All right. Given the potential benefits of rental properties for portfolio diversification and income generation, how should Canadian investors balance their allocation between traditional retirement savings vehicles like RRSPs and TFSAs and real estate investments to create a more robust retirement strategy in the face of economic uncertainties expected in 2025? I think we could drop that final clause from the question and just say, to create a more robust retirement strategy in general. I'm not sure that the answer is going to change based on the fact that it's 2025.
I think we've talked about in past episodes that buying direct investments in real estate is in many ways buying yourself a second job. And you can maybe earn extra income by working that job, but it's work. It's no joke. If you're just building a diversified portfolio of real estate assets, I think you can just do that through real estate investment trusts. Like if you look at the evidence on does private direct real estate investment perform better than REITs? No. REITs, publicly listed REITs tend to perform better. So I don't think you're gaining much other than maybe access to leverage and maybe an avenue to exercise your human capital to earn some income, which is unique to direct investment compared to a REIT. But I don't find real estate investing to be a particularly attractive asset class or job.
I hate it. I sold my rentals.
Yeah.
First. I had two, and like we held for 4, maybe 5 years. And I just got to a point where I was just like, why am I doing this? This sucks. Like, this is awful. I hate it. I hate the stress of it. And it is work. And I had property managers, but then you're just managing the property manager who's managing the tenant. Like, you're still communicating a lot. You still have to make decisions. You still have to pony up money. There's just still problems with it. And I was like, what are we doing? I just liquidated everything as soon as I could after I made that decision. So yeah, it's just not obvious to me that there are like de facto benefits to owning rental properties, especially to your point, Ben, when you can just go out and buy a very, very low cost, liquid, no work portfolio of rentals in like 3 clicks, right? Yeah, you're not going to get the leverage, which can work for and against you, and you could, in theory, go get leverage against that position. But yeah, I don't think it creates a more robust retirement strategy. People don't understand the risks of rentals. Every time I talk to somebody, they factor in 0 vacancy rates in their projections. Like, really, there's never going to be a month where there's like a tenant turnover. And yes, we have very, very high rental demand in Canada, but to assume that you're perpetually never going to have a 0 cash flow month, I think is just bad.
Well, it could be vacant for reasons other than not being able to find the tenant. There could be a problem with the unit that you have to take a couple months to fix or whatever.
Yeah, that guy I was talking about earlier who wants 10 million. He owns something like 14 or 15 rentals. And he has some really, really bad tenants, and a few of them have absolutely, I think he's kind of like a slumlord, to be honest. Like, I don't think these places are like the nicest places in the nicest areas, but like just some of the nightmare stories he told me about. And he sent me pictures of like tenants just absolutely trashing the place and like the cleanup and fixing costs and everything. Like, so that's work, but there's also like a massive financial and economic risk that most people just totally discount and just go, oh, real estate goes up, I should buy real estate. That's the extent of their analysis.
Yep.
I just add 2 things to that, like just to focus on the specific question when this person has asked, how should Canadian investors balance their allocation between traditional retirement savings vehicles and real estate? I mean, number 1, max your RRSP and TFSA before you even think about buying real estate. I mean, that would be my first reaction to that. So I would not, for example, purchase a rental property instead of investing in an RSP and a TFSA. It would have to only come after those accounts are maxed. And the last thing I would say about this one is I still personally feel exactly the same way as you guys. I would never buy real estate as an investment. I have 0 interest in it. I'm not convinced that it has a higher expected return than a more liquid portfolio. But one of the things I have come to understand over time in talking to people is that remember, we do this every day, but there are a lot of people out there who find investing in equities in particular completely alienating, confusing. You will even hear comments like the stock market is just a big casino, right? So it's people
Mhm.
who are clearly not comfortable with investing, even in a diversified equity portfolio. And so for those people, I understand it. If somebody said to me, the idea of investing, in the stock market just terrifies me. I want something that I can understand, like, buying a condo and renting it out and generating the income. I'm not going to argue with that. I mean, that's a behavioral argument. It's not a mathematical one, but I respect that it's a legitimate position for people to have.
Yep. Okay.
Good comments.
All right.
Yep. Good stuff. Next one. I'll read it out. What do you think is the most overlooked behavioral bias or misconception about investing that continues to harm individual investors, even among those who consider themselves financially literate? It's a great question.
I would say
An
it's
easy question
okay. Don't you go?
for
You
me.
go.
Overconfidence.
Okay,
Yeah,
nice.
I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know if it's overlooked. I mean, I guess people who are overconfident overlook it themselves. I think most of the rest of people realize that, especially people who consider themselves financially literate, are most likely to be overconfident. And, you just start to think that you know more than the market. This is
Mm-hmm.
really easy. All of these decisions, are easy to carry out. And then you realize you don't necessarily know as much as you thought you did. So that continues to haunt everybody, I think, to some
Mm-hmm.
extent.
Yeah, mine's related. I was going to say a bias for action.
Mm.
People feel like
Mm-hmm.
they should do something and they have to do something. And when the
Yeah.
market changes, when the tariff thing or Bitcoin goes up or US stocks outperform Canadian stocks, people feel like they have to do something. And that's usually the
Mm-hmm.
wrong time to do something. And I mean, usually doing something is wrong in general, but especially after some big thing happens, responding to it right afterwards is not usually the right thing to do. But yeah,
Yeah.
that bias for action, I think, is huge. And people who know more, in a lot of cases, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, people who know more will suffer from it worse because they'll think they understand what's going on, or they will understand what's going on, and that seemingly makes it more obvious that they should do something. But usually, doing nothing is really hard, but it's usually the wisest thing to do in investing.
Mm-hmm.
Have you guys heard about the study that they did about soccer goalies on penalty kicks? It was
No.
it was to demonstrate this idea of action bias. And I mean, I may not be summarizing it as accurately as I should, but the basic idea was most soccer goaltenders would have been best if they had just stood on the spot for a penalty kick.
That's
But
crazy.
if they just stood on a spot and someone, the shooter kicked it into the corner, they would look like a fool. Why didn't you
Mm-hmm.
dive?
Yeah.
So they dive on every shot. And
Wow.
anybody who's ever watched a penalty kick or a shootout has seen, half the time you dive in the opposite direction. And and once it looks ridiculous sometimes when you dive to the right and they shoot to the left, but you say, well, he had to do something,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
That's
so there's that
hilarious.
action bias in there as well. And yeah, to your point, and it feels often like doing nothing when you have a long-term buy and hold strategy. But the way I like to frame it to clients, I said, we're not doing nothing. We came up with a thoughtful long-term approach, and now we're sticking to it with discipline. That's not nothing. That's the
Mm-hmm.
opposite of nothing.
That's right.
Yeah. Doing nothing is action, right? It is a
Mm.
decision that you are making. And this is why I always tell people don't check their portfolios, because every time you do, whether you're consciously doing it or not, you're making a decision to buy, hold, or sell. And the more you look at your portfolio, the more interactions you're giving yourself where you have to make this buy, hold, sell decision, right? And people don't do well with that. And I think to summarize my thoughts on it, I think recency bias, which plays into the other two, but I think recency bias is a really, really dangerous one too, right? Um, we all have clients who just, why should I not go 100% US stocks? Why should I not go 100% Bitcoin? Why did you not own this asset class that did the best last year, right? People have a really, really difficult time looking far back in the past and looking far into the future. Like I think we tend to live our lives in these like 1 or 2 year kind of like goalposts, if you will. So it's really, really difficult to understand that you have maybe a very, very well diversified, very evidence-based, logic-based portfolio when you see stuff like, oh, Bitcoin's up 104% last year, why didn't I do that? And I've lost to clients over that in the past, where it's like you had a balanced 60-40 portfolio, but the S&P 500 was up 20% last year. Why didn't you outperform the S&P? It's like, okay, well, if you're going to benchmark to whatever went up the most last year, then you're just going to be continuously disappointed for your entire life. I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do about that. So I think recency bias plays into that a lot.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Well, one quick aside, your story about the soccer penalty kickstand, I found really interesting. There's a book, and I can't remember what it is, but it talks about how in the NBA, if your 3-point throws were, and Ben, you might know about this, but if you did like the granny style, like underhand, the percentage of making the 3-point shot goes up like by a huge amount. And so it's actually way better to shoot that way, but nobody will do it because it's just so embarrassing to do. Right. And I think there was one coach who like tried to get, I think it was a women's team, actually, like an Olympic US women's team or a college team, to start shooting that way. And they were practicing that way. And then when they went to play their first game, nobody shot that way because they were just so embarrassed that to actually look kind of foolish in shooting that way. So just funny.
That's hilarious. Probably free throws, not 3-point shots.
Or maybe it was, yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think it was free throws. I don't know much about basketball.
That's funny though.
Ben, have you
all
ever
right.
thrown a granny style 3-pointer?
In my life, probably yes. In a game, no, never. And I would be pretty embarrassed to do it. I'm a decent free throw shooter. I don't know if my percentage would be better with the granny shot unless I started practicing with it. All right, next one. What percentage of your personal portfolio is allocated to stocks, and what influenced that specific allocation decision? Personally, I'm 100% in stocks. What influenced it? It was already at that level before the Scott Cederberg paper that, if anything, increased my conviction in that, at least for now. Why was it there? I don't know. I'm young enough. I could take equity risk. Very comfortable with stocks and how markets work. Not at all concerned behaviorally. And I think I have the capacity. So my behavioral loss tolerance is there. I can handle volatility. I have the capacity to take risk. And yeah, I guess that's it. I'm very comfortable where I am with 100% stocks.
Do you ever expect to change that allocation as you get older?
I honestly, so like when you look at the Scott Cederberg research, it would suggest that nobody should ever hold bonds throughout their entire life cycle. I'm not saying that's what people should actually do. But that research does support that. I don't know. I think about it sometimes. I think I would be comfortable carrying on the way that I'm set up now, but I'm not anywhere near retirement, so it's kind of hard to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, you're triple leveraged. 100%.
Obviously,
yeah.
TQQQ, baby,
Yeah.
all day. It's up so much too. It's like by far the best performing position that I have over the past, whatever it is, 6 months. And I'm talking about recency bias, and we talked about FOMO and stuff. And you just kind of look at it sometimes. You're like, what? Maybe there's something there. But otherwise, yeah, no, I'd say I'm 100% stocks. Like my liquid, like RSPs, CFSA, non-registered portfolios, and Dan, my kids' RESPs are all 100% global equity.
Yep.
I do have a bit of Bitcoin. That's not a recommendation. I'm just saying I do have some Bitcoin and have had it for a long time. It started as like a totally meaningless amount of money, but because of Bitcoin's performance since I think about it in 2016, 2017, it has become something, I think, like 3 to 5% of my overall portfolio. That doesn't include the value of my home. I'm just talking about investments. But for me, that's just purely speculative, and I don't really think about that as part of my portfolio because in my head, it could go to zero at any time. But otherwise, yeah, I don't anticipate ever not being 100% equity for my investment portfolios, but older Mark might feel totally different about that.
Older Dan feels different about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
I started. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, Dan.
No,
I started
please.
when I first saved my first $50 biweekly pack at my first job. It was to a 60-40 portfolio, and I knew very, very little. And then I eventually increased it to 80-20 and then to 100% equity. So I didn't always have 100% equity. That developed over time.
Yeah, I would think it was sort of the same in that when I started kind of saving and investing. I just used a traditional balanced portfolio, and I've never moved away from it.
Hmm.
So, yep. And, you know, going back to the point about earlier about, you know, the terminal wealth and, you know, take as much risk as you need. I'm perfectly content with the expected return on a balanced portfolio. I don't think I need any more, and it wouldn't enhance my life to, you know, have higher investment returns at the cost of greater volatility. And I think the other part of it is too, you have to always be considerate of what you do for a living. And our business and my income is intimately tied to stock market returns. And so if my personal portfolio was also 100% stocks, and you guys are in a similar situation, that would be more risk than I would be comfortable with.
Mhm. All right. Do we have time for one more, Mark?
Yeah, we
I
can
know
do
you
one
got to
more.
run.
That's
One more,
okay.
and we
We
got
can
a
do one
couple reviews too. Are you okay for that?
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I had a meeting, but I pushed it back to 12
Oh, okay, good.
my time.
Okay.
So we're good. We got
Okay,
some
so
time.
we'll do this one more question then.
Yep.
Maybe two, because this one's gonna be quick. Do you believe in bonds? I put that one in there because I thought it was a funny question. Now, I've never actually seen a bond, personally, so I'm pretty sure they're real, but I'm not 100% sure because I've never actually seen one other than on a computer screen. What do you guys think? Are bonds real? Do you believe in bonds?
Are they a myth?
They are a myth.
Do I believe they
But,
exist? I do believe they exist. I haven't seen one, but I do believe they exist. I don't know. It's a tough question, right? Like traditional sort of financial models in theory are all just, you know, invest in bonds up to your risk tolerance, your risk capacity. It's a non-correlated asset. It's going to reduce expected returns and volatility somewhere on a sliding scale from 0 to 100% in equity. The rest should be in bonds. And that just makes sense. It's intuitive. It's kind of easy to accept. And I think once you start looking at other research like Cederberg stuff or anything that really points out that inflation is largely the biggest risk that a lot of people are going to face, especially in retirement, personally, I think the argument for bonds mathematically becomes a lot less compelling. I think Dan, you just touched on this, but like behaviorally, I think there's a good argument for, in some cases, why bonds might make sense. I don't own any bonds. I don't expect to. I do believe they're real, and I do believe they serve a purpose in a portfolio, depending on your risk capacity and profile. But I do think it's very worthwhile to point out to people who are buying bonds that over the long run, inflation is really, really dangerous, and bonds can hurt you there.
so that's an interesting, you know, because it comes up a lot, right? And a lot of people will say, you know, the history shows us that equities have a far greater expected return than bonds, and so bonds don't make any sense, right? But bonds were never in a portfolio to enhance return, right? So the question becomes, I guess, A, are you comfortable with the volatility of 100% equities? To which the corollary question there that I will say to clients, how would you feel if you lost half of your life savings in 6 months, right? Because this has happened before, it will probably happen again. And if your answer is, I would not be comfortable with that, then what do you do? So, how do you reduce volatility in a portfolio if it isn't with bonds? And I'm not saying that there are no other ways. I'm just saying, how would you do it? I don't know, GICs and cash, something like that. I don't know if that's a fundamentally different risk profile than holding bonds, but I mean, I do think we have to ask the question, like, why are bonds in the portfolio? They're there to reduce the volatility of an equity portfolio. That's like 90% of the reason. This idea they generate income, okay, they do, but I'm not sure that that's primarily why they're there because equities can generate income too. Lots of other investments can generate income. But they are a way of dampening volatility, and they do have historically some negative correlation with equities. So if you're not going to use them, what are you going to use instead, assuming that you're not 100% equities?
It's super hard to think about because, like, I agree. They've in many cases been had low correlations with stocks, but they've gone through periods of high correlation, and it's kind of varied through time. The stock bond correlation, it's this moving thing. Um, and then the other really interesting thing that I find about bonds is that they for sure reduce nominal volatility. But if you compare like real drawdowns, like in real terms, adjusted for inflation, a portfolio of stocks and bonds can have drawdowns that are about as bad as equities, or at least pretty close, because bonds tend to get hit really, really hard during periods of high inflation. So you can have that. But to your point, Dan, you don't see that. You might feel it, but you won't really see it in your portfolio. So I think from the perspective of sticking with it, bonds do still help. And then the other thing that I find really interesting about it is just for a long-term investor, one of the things that really matters is how stock returns or asset returns in one period are related to asset returns in another period. With stocks, when you have a period of really bad returns, it tends to be followed by a period of better returns more often than not. With bonds, it's actually the opposite. If you have a period of really bad returns, it tends to be followed by more really bad returns. And that's kind of driven by inflation again. So stocks have negative autocorrelation in returns, which makes them less risky at long horizons. Bonds have the opposite, which makes them more risky at long horizons. So it's really hard. I've got a video that I've been working on sequence of returns risk, which is the idea that a volatile portfolio is risky because if you get a bad sequence of returns, if you get like a bunch of bad years in a row, it can really damage your ability to fund your consumption in the future. Like if you're spending from that portfolio, it is an important piece of that. And so it's like, okay, so we add bonds, but the problem is because of their positive autocorrelation, sequence of returns risk can actually be worse in bonds than in stocks for someone who's spending down their portfolio in retirement. So I don't know. Like I don't have the answer, but I think it's not as straightforward as it's often framed, as bonds just being like a less risky asset. They're a less volatile asset in nominal terms. That is true, but that's kind of not the end of the story. Like it's a topic that probably doesn't get enough attention in general. Okay, we said that was going to be quick. It wasn't really quick. Should we do one more though?
Sure, we can do one more.
Okay, last one. What have you changed your mind about in 2024? I'll go first. I really do think doing the modeling of historical outcomes for renters and owners in Canada over the period 2005 to 2024, and then playing with sensitivities around savings rates, investment returns, investment fees. I was like, man, like it's really sensitive to all that stuff. And most people are probably going to screw it up. So I think it's important to be able to tell someone that and be like, listen, if you're not going to screw this up, like if you're listening to this podcast and you're super disciplined and you're going to have low investment fees and you're not going to time the market and all that stuff, renting is a perfectly viable option and you'll probably have a good outcome. Or you've got a good chance of having a good outcome. But if you're not listening to this podcast and you're just the average person with low financial literacy and you're subject to all the same behavioral errors that people make without having the knowledge to combat them, buying a house is probably a pretty good idea. So I don't think I've ever said that like everyone should rent, but I've been a proponent of renting as a viable option for housing. I think for a lot of people, owning is probably better because you have to do a lot of stuff right to be a financially successful renter.
Good answer. Dan?
I hate to parrot the same thing, but I would say that is the one idea that stuck with me the most over the last year or so. And just specifically focusing on this idea that, for as long as I can remember, the folk wisdom was that buying a home is forced savings. And it always seemed like something that was trite, that it was just something people said to encourage you to buy a house. But again, like you said, once you looked at the analysis and you realized that forced savings is incredibly valuable because unforced savings, which is what, renters or, people who don't own a home must do, is just way harder. Right. And I think, looking at that and thinking it through really reinforced just how true that is, just how much it's important to put people on a track where they basically have no choice but to save. Right. If you're investing in the markets and you're doing it voluntarily, it's way more difficult. So,
yep.
I didn't learn anything this year, so I don't have a good answer.
You're just too stubborn to change your mind about anything.
That's right. I'm a grumpy old man now. I don't change my mind about anything. No, it's tough. I didn't pre-read that question, so I didn't have a response prepared for it. And I think I'm sure I've changed my mind about a ton of things this year. I just don't know that I can put my finger on anything that was like really jumps out to me from like a financial planning standpoint. I think I've talked about this a little bit before. I was kind of quite against Bitcoin for a number of years. I bought Bitcoin in 2017 and then I started buying it and then I was like, this is really dumb. And then I listened like to the crypto series, man, that that you guys did. And I was like, what? Yeah, it has absolutely no utility. I don't like this at all. And I started kind of dunking on Bitcoin Twitter a little bit. And then they were like, well, have you done any research in it? And I was like, well, maybe not as much as I should. So you recommend me all these books and I'll go read them. And I did read a number of books and I thought they were very, very fascinating. And so I haven't gone from like a full disbeliever to like a Bitcoin maximalist or anything like that. But I'd say on that spectrum, I did kind of move where my position is. And again, that's not a recommendation to anybody, but after reading certain, and I think, Ben, you think the books that I read are absolutely ridiculous and they're just a joke and they're all wrong, but they're very well crafted stories. And I enjoyed them very much. And I started just thinking like, oh, I might be wrong about this, right? So that's probably one of the bigger attitude shifts I had. Again, not a recommendation.
The books aren't wrong. They're just, Bitcoin is an ideology more than it is anything else. And so if you believe in the ideology and if you agree with the ideology, then Bitcoin's really interesting because it expresses a certain way of thinking about the world and social interaction and economic interaction. And that's, I mean, that's kind of cool. And it's the fact that Bitcoin did that is kind of cool. I don't think that makes it inherently a good thing. And I think all the talking points in support of Bitcoin are ideological and like they're not true or false. They're just a way of thinking about the world. And if that's how you think about the world, Bitcoin does solve some pretty cool problems in some pretty cool ways. And clearly a lot of people at the moment think that that's worth something. Yeah,
I agree with exactly that. And that's why I think it's actually interesting, is because my own worldview could just be wrong and I don't really realize it. And we don't know how things are going to change in the future. But to your point, if you start from the premise that the world works a certain way, then it's a really, really interesting asset, right? And so for me, that's also the main risk of it, right? Is like, what if the way that the Bitcoin sort of ideologues think about the world, what if they're really, really wrong? Then this thing has very little actual value over time. And I just don't know if I'm right or wrong on anything. And so I was like, you know what, maybe I should just own a little bit and hedge my own stupidity.
I had some for a bit too. Not a recommendation either, but when I thought about it, the amount that I had wasn't tiny, but it was enough where if it 10x'd, it wouldn't change my life. And I was like, what am I doing? This is not even worth the time to have in my head that I own it. So I got rid of it.
Has it 10x since then?
No.
No. Okay. Just curious.